Alright, so we spent some time getting the players to the tomb. Either you drop the players off right in front of the tomb, or they started in town and they met each other and they saw the blacksmith come in, his daughter kidnapped, and they tracked the goblins. Either way, now they're standing outside the tomb, hiding in the trees, watching to see what's going on. This episode, we're going to talk about how to actually run the dungeon that is the tomb. This is going to include stuff like your first combat. It's going to include stuff like figuring out how does combat start exactly. And we're going to talk about the motivation of the goblins and how they react to various things that might happen. The DM has a lot of important jobs, but certainly near the top is the creation of verisimilitude. That means basically tricking the players into thinking that everything that's happening in the game is real. Now, it's not really a trick in the sense that they are unwilling, because it counts on them having something called willing suspension of disbelief. When the players show up at your game, they want to believe in the secondary world. The trick wouldn't work if they didn't. But if you present things to the player and describe the world that they see in a straightforward manner, and the bad guys and all the NPCs act plausibly and realistically, then your players will feel like this is really happening. I'm not just playing a video game where the different bad guys are on different scripts and paths that they'll follow. We're fighting goblins, and the goblins have their own goals. So let's talk for a second about what do these goblins want. I think that's one of the most important tools in your toolbox as far as presenting the world as a plausible place, knowing what the bad guys want. In this case, the goblins want to consecrate this tomb and turn it into a temple to their god. And the way they're going to do that is by sacrificing a human. That's why they kidnapped the blacksmith's daughter. It's worth it to spend some time thinking about what kind of victim will most effectively motivate your players. I picked a young girl because that's the traditional sacrifice to a dragon victim. But think about the kind of people in real life that your players care about. Maybe they care about their parents. Maybe they care about their grandparents. Maybe they have a special connection to a brother or a sister. In that case, use a character like that. The goblins don't care. They just want blood. So the goblins aren't just going to sit there and let the players steamroll over them. In every instance, when the players encounter the goblins, there's an opportunity for one or more goblins to retreat and go alert the rest of the tomb. And the first time that happens, that will freak the players out. Now, it may occur to the players that if they're not stealthy, that if they don't do a good job sneaking into the final battle, that the goblins may just sacrifice their victim preemptively. But I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't punish the players for failing to be stealthy. I would just say, look, the ritual is going to take as long as it takes, and at the end of that period, this victim is going to die. And the worst case scenario is just the goblins become aware of the heroes, they go get more allies, they're hard to surprise, and the players end up fighting more goblins in one battle than they would like. So that is our tool to present the tomb as a real living thing. Every encounter, there's the opportunity for the goblins to retreat and go get more allies. Reinforcements. The first time that happens, the players will be surprised. So the first potential encounter is the Goblin Patrol. We put a Goblin Patrol around the tomb because we wanted the tomb to seem dynamic. Everyone inside the tomb is basically sitting around waiting for the ritual to be finished, or really waiting for the players to show up, although they don't know it. But the Goblin Patrol is the dynamic element. Either the players notice the patrol or they don't, and each outcome is interesting. So how do we find out if the players notice the patrol? Well, first of all, they have to decide to wait and watch. If the players decide we're going to try and move forward and attack the goblins that are on guard in front of the door, then the Goblin Patrol won't notice them. But if the players decide, no, we want to stay here and watch the tomb for a little while, that's when the patrol has a chance to come by and see them. I think when you're running a scenario like this, one of the most difficult things to do, or to learn how to do, is to figure out how does combat start? How do we go from two different groups of people, the goblins and the heroes, neither aware of the other, to both of them fighting? Especially when they're outside, out in the open, it can be a little confusing. Like, the players will ask, how far away are the goblins? And you might not know immediately. There's actually a really interesting chart on the inside of the DM's screen. And if you don't have the DM screen, I recommend you go get one. We'll talk about the uses of the DM screen in another episode. I think it's very interesting. There's a lot of psychology bound up in the DM screen. But on that screen, on the right panel, there's a little chart for starting encounter distance. And it gives you a list of terrain, where is the encounter happening, and a random number that you can generate to say how many feet away from the heroes are the bad guys. In a dungeon, this isn't that big a deal because the encounters are a lot more self-contained. There are rooms and hallways and corridors, but out in the open, there is no easy answer to this. So the first thing we need to know, and this is one of the most complex parts of D&D combat, is who notices who first. This is called determining surprise. Is either side surprised by the other? Now, if both sides know that there are bad guys around, then there's no opportunity for surprise. But in this case, the players don't know there's a Goblin Patrol, and the Goblin Patrol is not really aware that these heroes are here. Feel free to ask your players a leading question like, are you guys trying to hide, or are you trying to avoid being seen? That's a better way of putting it. They will almost certainly say, oh yeah, even if they hadn't thought of that before you asked. You could just say, well, you didn't tell me you were trying to stay hidden, so the Goblin Patrol finds you. But remember, you're the DM. You have near infinite power on your side of the screen. It's always a good idea to give the players the benefit of the doubt. It is, I think, a poor DM who says, well, you didn't say you were hiding, so the Goblin Patrol ambushes you. You don't need to do stuff like that to challenge the players, and they will resent you for that kind of attitude. One thing we didn't talk about when we were designing this adventure was how many goblins are in each encounter. And there really isn't a wrong answer. If you buy an adventure module or you download one from the internet, you may see, oh, it says here there are 3 orcs. It's okay if there are only 2 or if there are 4. You should think instead about what is the purpose of this encounter. Not every encounter needs to be a life or death situation. You should pepper every adventure with some easy encounters and some medium encounters and some difficult encounters. Even an easy encounter, the players will lose a couple of hit points and have to spend some resources healing. And they may cast some spells that they'll have to rest to get back. And over the course of the adventure, these things all add up. So our Goblin Patrol doesn't need to challenge the players. Let's use 2 goblins. 2 goblins presents the opportunity for one goblin to get damaged and the other goblin to run off and alert his buddies. And when that happens, your players are going to freak out, because they may never have played a game in which the bad guys act that intelligently. And if they're first level, a single goblin arrow can actually do a lot of damage. So let's find out who notices who. Have every player make a stealth check, and have the goblins make a stealth check. This may be the first time they've made a stealth check, and they will discover that some of them are better at stealth than others. Typically, it's the thief and the ranger who do well at stealth, and the fighter and the paladin who do poorly at it. So some of your players may have very high stealth checks, and it's going to be hard for the Goblin Patrol to notice them, and some of them are going to have very low stealth checks, and those are the ones the goblins will notice. The flip side of that is, do the players notice the goblins? So have the goblins make stealth checks. I think 1 check for both goblins is fine, but if you want to, you can make a check for each individual goblin. Every character's stealth check, all the players, all the goblins, acts as the DC for every character's perception check. So now it's time for everyone to make perception checks. Perception is based on wisdom, which is to say, how good are you at noticing things? And again, some players are going to have a high perception, some players are going to have a low perception. When the goblins make their perception check, compare it against the hero's stealth checks. Probably some of those heroes are going to be noticed by the goblins. Likewise, every player compares their character's perception check against the goblin's stealth check. Every character whose perception check beats the goblin's stealth check gets to act in the first round of combat. It's possible, I suppose, there is a degenerate case where no one on either side notices the other, in which case they just pass each other like 2 ships in the night. I don't know why that's a metaphor. Wouldn't ships in the night notice each other? Don't they have lights on? Whatever. But that's not likely. Probably somebody on one side is going to notice somebody on the other side. And once you've figured that out, once you know who has noticed who, it's time for initiative. Literally say, okay, everybody, roll initiative. That phrase is the universal symbol for combat is beginning. If a character, either a hero or a goblin, did not notice the enemy, then on the first round of combat, they are surprised. A character, either a good guy or a bad guy, who is surprised does not get to act in the first round of combat. They don't get to move, they don't get to attack, they don't get to take any reactions. They just basically sit there, literally surprised. So have each player roll initiative, which means roll a 20-sided die and add their dexterity modifier, and do the same thing for the goblins. Then make a list of the order everybody acts in from highest to lowest. This is going to take a second or 2, but you only have to do it once for the entire combat. Typically I do this behind the screen so the players don't know when do the goblins go. That's a useful bit of tactical information, and there's no way they would know that until the goblins act. Once the goblins have acted, though, there's no reason to try to hide their initiative. Everybody knows what it is. And it's super useful for everybody to be able to see the initiative order, so I'll often write it down on the battle mat or I'll write it on a whiteboard. We're not going to get too noodly into how to run combat. That's not exactly the point of this tutorial. We'll talk about stuff like that in other episodes. This is just an overview to get you feeling comfortable with the ideas. So you figured out who noticed who first, which means you know who's surprised and who gets to act in the first round of combat. You've called for initiative, you've rolled initiative for the goblins, and you've written everything down in initiative order. Now it's time to fight. Goblins are smart enough to do stuff like shoot at the lightly armored characters first. For instance, the wizard is usually lightly armored. Go ahead and have the goblins attack him. Goblins are smart enough to avoid shooting the guys in heavy armor because they know they're going to miss. Goblins know how armor works and they know how weapons work. So go ahead and use the goblin shortbows and have them try to pick off the wizard. The wizard has low hit points, he has a low armor class, and a single hit from a goblin can do a lot of damage to a wizard. And that's another little trick. It's not that big a deal, but it makes the players feel like, wow, the goblins are smart. They're thinking tactically. They're not just blindly attacking the giant meat shield and heavy armor that we put in the front of the party on purpose. No, of course not. The goblins want to win. The bad guys don't know that their job is to create drama for the players. They think their job is to win. And if the players feel that way, not only will they feel challenged, they will believe in the world you're creating. So the goblins attack the players attack the goblins. What happens? Well, the most likely outcome, unless you have very few players, is that the heroes are going to kill the goblins. They're just goblins. It's very unlikely that the goblins will just wipe out the party. That would be a very interesting beginning to your first D&D campaign. 2 goblins murdered the entire party. So after the first round, every time the goblins go until they're both dead, I would make a check and see have they taken any damage. Once they've taken damage, I would have them retreat. Now they know the players are a threat, we need to go alert our buddies. And I would have the goblins spend 1 round moving and then attacking. That lets the players know, hey, these guys are trying to retreat, they're trying to alert their friends. And it's likely that the goblins will die in that next round of combat. But if they live, at that point I would have the goblins shout to their buddies and say, in Goblin, that there are intruders coming. At which point, the Goblin Patrol will have done its job and successfully alerted the goblins in the tomb. And that will radically change the behavior of the goblins. So most likely scenario is the players wipe out the goblins. Next most likely scenario is when the goblins act on the second turn, some of them are damaged and they begin to retreat, in which case it's still likely that the players will shoot them before they get too far away. But there is the chance that if the goblins survive, let's say 2 rounds of combat and they've begun retreating, they alert the tomb, and now all the goblins in the tomb are aware the players are coming. The 2 guards outside the door retreat inside. The players will notice that and they'll go, oh, great. And at that point, the players will realize that there are consequences to our actions, and that is one of the most important lessons in Dungeons & Dragons. So the players take care of the Goblin Patrol, and now it's time for them to go to the tomb proper. There are 2 goblins on guard standing on either side of the door in. If they've been alerted, they're already inside, and they join the next encounter, making the next encounter more difficult. When the players get close enough, make sure you describe the 2 goblins on patrol on either side of the doors, and the doors as having been broken down, because that's how the goblins got into the tomb. The stone door was sealed and had been for hundreds of years, and it was too strong for any normal human to open. The players may wonder, how did goblins get this open? Well, they're going to find out. But if they're still on guard, standing on either side of the door, then the players have a couple of options. They can either use their bows and their spell attacks to try to kill the goblins at range, which could have catastrophic consequences, because if they don't succeed on that first round of combat of killing the goblins, then when the goblins get to go, they're going to retreat inside. There is no way these 2 goblins try to stand and destroy the players. It's up to the players to try to stop them. Probably the best scenario for the players is one where they use the geometry of the tomb to come up and surprise the goblins from the side. Goblins are clever, but they're not that smart. They're certainly not as smart as humans and elves and dwarves. So these goblins will be shifty and lazy, and they'll be leaning on their weapons, and they will assume that the Goblin Patrol is doing its job and they don't have a care in the world. And if the players use the tomb as cover and come up around the side, then they'll get the drop on these goblins. And in a situation like that, neither side has to make perception checks. The heroes are going to surprise the goblins. So that means the players are probably going to get a full round of combat where the goblins are like, oh my god, what is going on? And then any players who got a higher initiative than the goblins will get another chance to act on the second round of combat before the goblins go. That's the power of surprise. Players with surprise and high initiative will get to act twice before the bad guys go. Notice that every encounter provides the opportunity for these goblins to go alert all the rest of the goblins. That kind of guerrilla commando action where the players have to be quiet, they have to be stealthy, they have to stop the goblins from escaping, is going to make them feel like badass special forces guys, which is a compelling fantasy. So either the players kill the goblin guards, or the goblin guards manage to escape and get into the tomb and join their buddies inside. Either way, that's the first encounter down. Now the players have to descend into the tomb. Remember to describe the tomb using as many senses as seem reasonable to you. What do the players see? It's very dark in the tomb. The goblins have dark vision. They don't need light. And what do they hear? If they listen, they probably hear the goblins chanting deep in the tomb. The ritual is underway. How does it smell? It may smell dry and musty because it's an old tomb, or it might smell like goblin poop. So what do they see? What do they hear? What do they smell? These are useful tools that help the players feel immersed in the situation. Again, it's that process of tricking them into suspending their disbelief, which they want to do anyway. So they descend down the stairs and enter the offering room. This is the room with a brazier in the middle and carvings along the walls of the knights and what they did in life. And there's a bunch of goblins here. Now, one of the important rules of 5th edition D&D, and that's the default edition for these videos, is that anytime your players are outnumbered, they are in danger, because the toughness of bad guys is often measured not in hit points or armor class, but in the number of attacks they get. I mean, hit points and armor class factor into that. But if the goblins are getting more attacks per round than the heroes, then the heroes are going to find themselves in a bad situation, especially at first level. Even goblin weapons do a lot of damage to first level heroes. One more goblin than the number of players is probably not that big a deal, so go ahead and try that. Notice that I didn't start with a fixed number and then add 2 if the goblins on guard come inside, because that could create a situation where, let's say I said there were 4 inside and then there were 2 outside. Now there are 6 goblins, and if you only have 4 players, they could be in trouble. I just decided that there are a certain number of goblins in here, and that if the players alerted the guards outside, then they are included in that number. We're going for the illusion that this encounter has been strengthened by the goblins outside, not the reality. Now, if they decide to go down into the offering room and fight the goblins, remember, during that fight, if they didn't encounter the patrol around the tomb, this is where the patrol comes and ambushes them from behind. And now you have an interesting dynamic combat in which there are goblins in front of the players and goblins behind the players. And the players who thought they were safe in the back of the party discover the opposite. They are now the front of the party for these goblins. Either way, this is one of the largest battles the players will have had. If they fought the goblin patrol, that was only 2 goblins. If they fought the goblins on guard, that was only 2 goblins. Now we're talking about 4 or 5 goblins, and things are going to get interesting. If the players have successfully dealt with the patrol and the guards, then they have the chance to get surprise on these goblins because they're down there just relaxing and have no idea that the players are coming. Otherwise, the players may have an interesting situation because if these goblins are aware the players are coming and the players are aware the goblins are coming, each side is waiting for the other to do something. At which point, the players may start thinking outside the box. They may decide, wait a minute, do they know we're coming? Then let's not go down there. You know what, let's take some oil and pour it down there and light it on fire and flush the goblins out. Fire is a great way to flush guys in a dungeon out of the dungeon. I tend to run every game like the Kobayashi Maru.
I don't believe this was a fair test of my command abilities.
And why not?
Because there was no way to win.
A no-win scenario. Or a better way of putting it is a scenario in which the bad guys want to win. It's therefore your player's job to change the conditions of the test.
Lieutenant, you are looking at the only Starfleet cadet who ever beat the no-win scenario.
How?
I reprogrammed the simulation so it was possible to rescue the ship.
What?
He cheated.
I changed the conditions of the test. Got a commendation for original thinking. I don't like to lose.
Then you never faced that situation. Faced death.
I don't believe in the no-win scenario.
You have presented them with a scenario. There is a host of goblins in the next room at the bottom of the stairs. They can just go downstairs and start fighting the goblins in a scenario where the goblins outnumber them and are ready for them. And in fact, if this is the first time you've played, it is likely that they will do that. I've introduced probably, close to 100 people to D&D over the last 30 years, and first-time players in a situation like this, they are not used to changing the conditions of the test. They will often end up in a situation where they are overwhelmed, or they're outnumbered, or the dice go against them, and the goblins get the better of them. And after that battle, maybe a player died, maybe there was a total party kill. That's possible. I've played in games with experienced DMs where the first session everybody died. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's okay if everyone dies as long as all the players feel like, yeah, that's what would have happened. It's not okay if they think, that was bullshit. What should we have done? New players often feel that way. They often feel like they have no options. They feel like they have to accept what you tell them as the only truth. And getting them over that hump from just accepting everything you put in front of them to starting to use the environment and invent new options can be tough. If a combat like that goes badly, the players have to retreat, or they lose a member, or they lose all their members in a total party kill, I try to avoid telling the players, okay, well, here's what I think you should have done. Because the goal of D&D is not to make me look smart and all-knowing, it's for everybody to have a good time. Instead, I'll tell the players, well, here's what other groups have done in that same situation. Now, that's something I can get away with because I've been running the game for 30 years. You may not have that option. You may have to say this in your own way. Instead, I'll say, well, one group of players came down here, and when they saw this situation, they didn't go down those stairs and walk into an ambush. Instead, they made camp outside the tomb. They lit a fire, and they used their bedrolls and their packs to make it look like they were sleeping around the fire, but in fact, they were waiting outside the circle of firelight for the goblins to come out. Now, that may seem like an obvious trap that the players are laying, but goblins are dumb. Let the goblins fall for something like that. But this is all worst case scenario stuff. It's entirely plausible that your players are going to go down those stairs and wipe the goblins out. In a later episode, we'll talk about how to run combat such that if things start going badly, you can kind of behind the scenes try to avoid a situation where there's a total party kill. So either the players just go down there and fight the goblins, or they try to lure the goblins out, or they try to smoke the goblins out, but one way or the other, they need to deal with those goblins in the offering room. Once the goblins are dead, the players should notice the room. Describe the room to them. There's carvings of knights on one wall, and they're fighting bad guys. Maybe they're fighting goblins. On the other side of the offering room is carved into the stone the oath of the Delian Order. I swear to fight chaos in all its forms, etc., etc. And you can feel free to change that to whatever you think sounds good. Remember, the point of the oath on the wall is to give the players later on in the dungeon the opportunity to swear fealty to the Delian Order, and that will allow them to enter the secret room where all the treasure is. So the players have dealt with the goblins in the offering room. They've had an opportunity to notice what's in the offering room. It may occur to them to search the offering room. I don't think there's really anything in the offering room for the heroes to find other than whatever small change the goblins might have had on them. But that's up to you. Maybe there is some treasure in here. Maybe there is a potion or two or a scroll. If there's some consumable magic items in here like a healing potion or a magic scroll, it would have to be hidden somewhere that the goblins didn't notice it. Otherwise, why didn't the goblins use it? So they fought the goblins in the offering room, maybe they've searched the offering room, you've described the offering room to them so they see the knights fighting and they see the oath. Now it's time to deal with the trap. It may not even occur to the players to look for traps. This will fix that. After this encounter, the players are going to be super paranoid about traps, which is part of the fun. Back in the 70s, when you made a character, you noticed on the list of equipment that one of the things you could buy was a 10-foot pole. And you wondered to yourself, what is the purpose of a 10-foot pole exactly? Am I supposed to vault over things? Well, the way they played back then, one player would be in front with the 10-foot pole tapping the floor or maybe even the ceiling of the dungeon in front of them to listen for hollow noises and to see if they could trigger any traps in front of them. Well, this trap is a pressure plate trap. It only goes off if someone steps on it, and it has to be someone that weighs more than, let's say, a goblin or a halfling. So if for some reason you have a halfling in the front of the party, he can easily walk over this trap without triggering it. But if he's a thief and he's searching as he goes, he will notice the trap. Otherwise, as the players walk down the corridor, they might just set the trap off. If you are a particularly benevolent GM, you might ask them to make perception checks. Now that's a tricky situation. Asking the players to make a perception check tells them there's something to find. At which point, if they all fail their perception checks, they start to get paranoid. And that tends to slow everything down. But a benevolent DM might set a reasonable DC, say 11 or 12, for seeing the trap before you spring it. In which case, players who roll high might notice there's a trap there. Otherwise, the players step on the trap and a giant scythe comes out of the ceiling and attacks one of the players. Make an attack roll for the scythe. Give it an attack bonus roughly equivalent to the goblins. Maybe you think the trap is nastier than a goblin, or maybe it's not as nasty as a goblin. That's up to you. And in that adjudication, you are doing some next level DM work. Now you can decide to go to the DM's guide and look up traps and find out how they work and find out what their bonus to hit is and find out how much damage they do based on what level they are. Or you could just decide they're about as tough as a goblin. They don't have hit points, they go off, they do their damage, and that's it. There are lots of goblins, but there's only one trap. So making the trap lethal, making the trap nastier than a goblin is perfectly legitimate. Or you might decide, wow, my players have really taken a beating from these goblins, so I'm going to make it so the trap doesn't do that much damage if it hits. So the players have maybe fought a patrol of goblins. They probably fought the goblins on guard outside the door. They dealt with the goblins in the offering room, either by going down there and fighting them or luring them out somehow. And maybe they stepped on a trap and took some damage. At this point, the players may think about resting. There are two kinds of rests in D&D. You can either take a short rest, which I believe is for about an hour, or you can take a long rest, which is basically spending the night. With a short rest, you get to spend your hit die and get a little bit of healing and some abilities reset. And a long rest, you get all your hit points back and all your abilities reset and all your spells refresh. A long rest would require leaving the dungeon and going and camping in the forest or something, in which case there would be a chance that the goblins or something else in the forest might come by and attack the players. But I think that even a short rest outside of town means there's going to be a random encounter. So if the players want to say, let's get out of here, let's go rest outside just for an hour and get some healing, I would say that's fine, and then I would roll for a random encounter. I would let the players know resting does not come without consequences. Because if they feel like resting is a given, if they feel like it's safe, then they're going to do it all the time. They'll do it after every battle. Just like the goblins want to win, the players want to win, and they will behave in a way that may be unrealistic for their characters, but maximizes their chances at victory. Now, in general, in my game, I make sure that if the players get a random encounter, it is nasty. It might be a creature like an owlbear or something comes by, something not directly related to the dungeon. If they try to rest inside the dungeon, which would be very foolish, I would have goblins come attack them. In fact, I would invent new goblins that weren't part of any encounter just to come attack these heroes. The players, of course, will think that they were the goblins in the next room, and that's fine, let them think that. When the players decide to take a short rest, I often have them roll for the random encounter just because I think it's more fun for them to be in charge of their fate. In this scenario, I would just say, okay, if you guys want to take a rest, that's fine, and I would roll for a random encounter behind the screen, and I probably would not, even if I rolled a 6, I would probably say nothing happens. The hour passes uneventfully. Because, after all, we want the players to have fun, and we know the secret of the players having fun.
Let the Wookiee win.
The Wookiee is, in this case, a metaphor. The players have dealt with lots of goblins, they dealt with a trap, and now it's time for them to go on to what they think will probably be the final battle. The goblin boss, the bugbear. So this is the encounter in the room with the statue of the leader of the order and the bugbear chieftain that's running these goblins. Bugbears are like big super goblins. Goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears are all kind of related. I like bugbears because they're big and they're tough, and I sort of look like a bugbear. Remember to describe the room again. Describe what the players see, describe what they hear, describe how it smells. There's a Goblin Shaman in here and he's burning incense. There's also the person they've come to save. I think there's a classic image that people might have of what it looks like to have a young girl being ready for sacrifice. And you can use that kind of imagery if you want, it is your game, but I think of that stuff as being incredibly sexist. And I think it affects the players a lot more especially if they're expecting something like that, if they walk into the room and they discover that the human they've come to save is locked in a tiny cage and is terrified and cold and is maybe filthy and their clothes have been torn and they're crying. That's probably what the goblins would do. They would keep them in a cage where the human can't get away. They don't care if the human is provocatively posed. That's ridiculous. And that kind of situation, the human afraid, cold, shivering, crying, covered in filth, that will make the players feel more empathy toward this person and make them want to rescue them more. It's funny, interesting things happen in D&D. Players who didn't know they had empathy suddenly discover it. So the bugbear's there, the Goblin Shaman is there. I mean, what is a Goblin Shaman? That's up to you. I would just take a normal goblin and give him one cleric spell, but in all other ways, he would be a normal goblin. Because the bugbear here is very tough, I would try to avoid a situation where goblins from other rooms in the tomb have come here to wait for the humans, because that could really turn this into a nasty battle. You know, this ritual takes hours to complete, so the Goblin Shaman has been down here chanting the entire time and has put up the do not disturb sign so that other goblins haven't come in here. That gives you the opportunity to tailor this bugbear encounter so that the players don't get overwhelmed. So a bugbear, 1 or 2 goblins in here, and that should be enough. And again, I think unless things have gone catastrophically bad up until now and the players have alerted several different groups of goblins, the players will actually have the opportunity here to get the drop on these guys. Because like I said, they're concentrating on the ritual. Either way, roll initiative, play out the combat. So up until now, the goblins haven't done anything particularly clever or smart other than have a patrol, but here we have a bugbear, and bugbears are like very smart goblins. So if during the course of this combat, one of the heroes goes unconscious, which is likely to happen, I would have the bugbear chieftain on his turn say to the heroes in Broken Common, "Leave and your friend lives." This may confuse the players because they haven't encountered something like this before. Wait a minute, if we leave, then why would our friend live? And then I would just explain that it is a tradition in this culture, in this area, it doesn't matter if you're a human or a goblin or an orc, that if you manage to take out one of your opponents and they're still alive, you ransom them back. I mean, there is a real world tradition, especially during the Middle Ages, of one army fighting another, capturing some of their guys, and ransoming those people back to the army for gold. And that's what this goblin wants to do. He knows humans are weak. He knows that if one of the heroes goes down, that he can capture that hero and sell him back to his buddies. We'll talk about bad guys and their tactics in another episode. I just wanted to give you an idea for something the Bugbear Chieftain could do that would surprise the players. If that sounds too complex and you don't really understand how that would play out, don't worry about it. Just have everybody fight to the death. That's typical goblin behavior. So you call for initiative, you run out the battle as normal, and hopefully at the end of it, the heroes are still alive and they've rescued the human victim from town. Now it's time for them to investigate this room and see what's going on. They'll notice there's a statue, they'll notice there's a statue of a knight, and they'll notice there's something written at the bottom. If you are to keep this, you must first give it to me. It's a riddle. And I want to emphasize, it is perfectly all right for the players not to solve the riddle. If the players come out of this adventure wondering, wow, what would have happened if we had gotten that riddle right? Then they're hooked, right? Then they believe in the secondary world. It's not a video game where they can load a saved game and try it again and try different options. It's one of the things that makes RPGs like D&D different from every other game. And if they don't get the riddle right after the game, they may ask you, hey, what was the answer to that riddle? Do not tell them. We're going to talk about this in another episode too, but in general, avoid showing the players the little man behind the curtain pulling all the levers.
Oz, you ungrateful creatures, think yourselves lucky that I'm giving you audience tomorrow instead of 20 years from now. Oh.
It ruins the players' fun, even though they want it. Do not give it to them. Okay, so they fought the bugbear, they fought the goblins, they rescued the girl, and maybe they figure out the riddle. Maybe they realize it means keep your word. Therefore, I have to give the statue my word. And they swear the oath of the Delian Order. Or they just say, I swear to fight evil, or I give you my word. I think anything like that would be fine. Then the secret door they didn't know was there slides open, revealing a room beyond. At that point, the players will be like, holy crap, what's in there? That might be a good stopping place, a cliffhanger. This exercise, these last 4 episodes we've done in this whole adventure, is really just to give you an idea of what starting a game of D&D is like, of what running an adventure is like, and to make you feel confident that you can do it. I have no real expectation that you will literally use this adventure, but if you did, you may discover that it takes you 3 or 4 hours just to get to the first encounter or the second encounter, at which point any of these encounters could be a cliffhanger. I literally just started a new campaign last week at work. I had a lot of content ready for them, and they literally got through one combat in 4 hours. But they had a lot of fun. They felt like they got a lot done. It was mostly role-playing and stuff like that, and that might be what your first session is like. But if you started the adventure by dropping the players in the woods outside the tomb, watching to see what was going on, then it's possible that they've made it this far in their first night. At which point, this would be an interesting place to stop. What's behind the secret door? Or maybe you still have plenty of time, in which case, to the undead. So here's where the Delian Order is buried. There are no bad guys in here as far as they can tell. There are 6 small sarcophagi, and there's 1 big sarcophagi. And I would take the time to describe each sarcophagi differently so that the players think, oh, these are the knights. This is each individual knight is here. And there's 1 big one, and that's where the lead knight is. Probably the dude whose statue is in the room outside. The players are naturally going to want to loot this tomb. They're going to look in the sarcophagi and see what's in there. In which case, undead attack. How many undead and what type are they? Well, that's up to you. I think zombies and skeletons are mostly interchangeable, and I would only have a couple of them attack the players. Now, remember, these undead are kind of sitting there on a trigger. They're not going to attack the players unless the players interfere with the sarcophagi. So it's perfectly reasonable for the players to spend the night in the tomb or outside the tomb with the human they've rescued before they go into this secret room. And now you have a choice. If the players go into the room without resting, that means they're going to be beat up, they're going to be low on spells, which means they're going to fight a small number of skeletons. Or zombies. But if they rest first, then man, I think there's going to be 5 or 6 zombies in here. Now, I think it should be possible for the players to recover the treasure without triggering the zombies. But for me, the only way that would be possible is if a paladin had sworn the oath of the Delian Order and made an honorary member of it. A paladin or a cleric who swears the Delian oath becomes an honorary member of their order, blessed by the ghost of the knights. So he can come into this room and he can take the magic items that are in here and nothing bad's going to happen to him. But unless that specific situation came up, I would say looting the tomb makes the undead attack. There's no surprise, it's just regular everyday initiative, it's a normal combat, and at the end, the players get the cool stuff in the sarcophagi. Remember, up until now, the players haven't gotten any treasure, so I would put a couple of 100 gold in there. It'll seem like a lot to them until they have to split it 4 or 5 or 6 ways. I would also put some consumable magic items in there, potions or scrolls. That's an easy way to give the players magic items without completely breaking your game, because regardless of how good the potion or scroll is, once they've used it, it's gone. And I would give them a +1 sword. I might even say it's a +1 sword +3 versus goblins. That's a mechanic they used back in the advanced Dungeons & Dragons days, the late 70s, early 80s. The idea that a weapon did one thing against everybody, but did a better thing against a specific kind of bad guy. Remember the carvings in the offering room of the knights fighting bad guys? Whatever bad guys you described the knights fighting, I would say this weapon is good against. It's a +1 weapon versus everybody, but it's a +2 or a +3 weapon versus those bad guys. Now, technically, as far as the DM's guide is concerned, that is a lot of magic to give a first level party. But I don't think it's that big a deal. It just means one person in the party is going to be really good against one type of bad guy. It'll make them feel special without grossly unbalancing the game. And players really like getting magic items as a reward. It will make them want to play again. So that's it. The players fought a bunch of goblins. They either triggered or avoided a trap. They fought the bugbear boss of the goblins. They rescued the girl, and maybe they found the secret door and the treasure that was hidden beyond. That's a whole adventure. My goal with this series is to convince you that being a DM is fun and that you would enjoy doing it. I'm not trying to convince you to use this adventure. This adventure is just an example of how I think and the stuff I've learned running D&D, especially for first-time players. What kinds of things can you expect to happen? You can find a link to the map of the dungeon and some notes in the doobly-doo down below. So you can either use this adventure or be inspired by this adventure to come up with your own, or go download a first-level adventure online. It doesn't matter to me, as long as you start playing. I was 16 when I ran my first game of D&D back in the 80s, and that was considered late. Most of my friends had started when they were 12. None of them started by reading the books and figuring it out on their own. All of them, including me, started because people they know, often their older brothers or people in the grade ahead of them, ran D&D for them, and they watched that guy running the game and thought, I could do that. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is to be that older brother or the kid one grade ahead of you in class saying, hey, let's play D&D, it's fun. And you see how I do it and you go, hey, I think I could do that. That's what the rest of this series is going to be about. It's going to be all the lessons I've learned from running D&D. What would you like to hear about? What would you like me to talk about? I like doing this stuff. I like talking about the game. I like talking about what I've learned. And the good news is, if you like listening, then there is a near infinite number of topics regarding being a good DM. Next week, we're going to talk about making characters from the DM's point of view. What are all these numbers and what do they mean? There's a lot of really weird stuff built into D&D that's not perfectly obvious the first time you play, and I think it's a good idea for the DM to understand these things so he can explain them to the players. We'll talk about different methods of stat generation, and we'll talk about the choices that players tend to make when they're making characters for the first time. So when you go through the process of making characters for the first time, your players may ask questions like, why does this work the way it does? Next week, you'll have the answers. But I want to know what you want to talk about. If you have any questions about running D&D, feel free to ask. I will make it a point to go through all the comments and answer them in following videos. So we made an adventure, we got the party together, we got the party to the dungeon, and then we ran the dungeon. Next week, we make characters for the first time. Peace out.